When the history of the gender wars is written, particularly the medical scandal of so-called gender-affirming care, it will be revealed that one state played an outsized role in forcing the issue into the public consciousness and helped bring about the political reckoning that halted the madness. The state of Alabama was the second in the nation, following Arkansas, to prohibit the chemical and surgical transing of minors. And although over half the states have since passed various bans on these practices, Alabama's law, the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, was arguably the strongest in the country. It went so far as to add criminal penalties to medical providers who administered puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to children and the performing of irreversible sex change surgeries on their developing bodies. In 2022, the Biden administration sued Alabama over its law in a case called Boe versus Marshall. Earlier this year, the Department of Justice under President Donald Trump dismissed that lawsuit. Yet what Alabama found because of the discovery process before Trump took office was staggering, and it continues to shape the debate around these issues. How did Alabama inevitably win this battle? And why did the Yellowhammer State fight so hard and take such an unequivocal posture against this experimental medicalization? In this episode, listener discretion is advised, as some of the elements of this story are not appropriate for young ears. We'll hear from three men who were instrumental in this fight. Dr. Patrick Lappert, a plastic surgeon from Alabama who has been among the most vocal doctors nationally exposing the harms. Wes Allen, the Alabama Secretary of State, who was a member of the State House of Representatives when the bill banning gender transitions on minors was passed. And Steve Marshall, the Attorney General of Alabama, whose investigations uncovered jaw-dropping information about the federal government's involvement in furthering transgender junk science. Marshall's efforts exposing the dark underbelly of the trans industry were so significant that he included his findings in a barn burner of an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the case of U.S. versus Scrimeti, which centered on the state of Tennessee's ban on transing minors. You might be inclined to think that in a conservative southern state like Alabama, the process to ban sex changes on children would have been rather easy. But according to Secretary Allen, it took several years and proved to be quite a challenge. Opposition came from many quarters. I asked him how it all began.
So about 2020, early 2020 or late 2019, Eagle Forum and some other groups approached me about sponsoring this legislation in the Alabama House of Representatives about the mutilation of these children and all the puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then, of course, potential surgeries after the puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So I thought it was horrendous. I said, yeah, let's dig into this. Let's look into it. And then ultimately led to me getting the bill drafted, which was a very strong bill at the time. And I think we've got the strongest bill in the country, quite frankly, with the felony provision. I was a House freshman. I was a former probate judge that served about 9.5 years in Pike County, serving the great people there. I carried those same values that I served with in the courthouse and carried those to the State House. We got the bill drafted, we got it introduced, and then, of course, you know what happened in March of that year. It was when COVID shut everything down, and, of course, it really hampered our legislative session that year. But before it was shut down, I did have the bill in committee, and, of course, all the protests and all the media that surrounded that piece of legislation. Of course, that was really, thinking back at that time, that was really right in the height of just so much woke. My goodness, you can remember that. You know, it was just an onslaught of opposition to protecting kids and with this piece of legislation. We felt really good about it, but obviously the COVID year kind of hampered that and killed off that bill that year. And then we brought it back in 21 and we got it right to the very end, last day of the legislative session, and just fell short. And then the next year we brought it back again, continuing to push, continuing to build the coalition, continuing to educate the public about why this was in the best interest of those children. And we got it passed, and very, very thankful.
Opposition didn't just come from Democrats. Attorney General Marshall said that in the beginning, it was even hard to make conservatives in the state understand the issue. They didn't get it, and they thought it was unimportant because it directly affected relatively few people.
The political reality was that when the effort first started, there was significant pushback, not just from the Democratic side of the aisle, but also many Republicans. They, number one, felt like this is really not an issue. Why are we talking about it? They were hearing from a small subset of parents that frankly were given false information about suicide risk and the opportunities to be able to address this absent medical intervention as opposed to traditionally what we've done for gender dysphoria. And then finally, there was the sense that somehow or another, if Alabama engaged in the protection of kids, that we were a backward state and weren't acting in a way that was truly appropriate for children and society as a whole. And I give our legislature a great deal of credit for finally understanding where we needed to land. And I think we were the second or third state across the country to be able to do it. But there's no doubt, especially when you look at the passage of time, policymakers have learned on this issue, but just the public at large, about the fraud that was perpetuated both from the medical and legal side on innocent parents and kids, and where we now have gotten to the point of, I think, really being able to celebrate the successes we've made in protecting kids.
Remarkably, the Alabama legislature ultimately landed on a strong law with substantial teeth, criminally penalizing doctors who perform gender interventions on children. But what the Attorney General's office knew they had to do was go after the clinical guidelines from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, also known as WPATH. The WPATH standards of care were persuading judges and medical associations that their guidelines were backed by robust science, and thus they had to be deferred to professionally. I asked Attorney General Marshall why he decided to be as aggressive as he did, particularly given the likelihood that the strong penalties would make judges who were uninformed about the issue more inclined to strike it down.
I think to the extent that you want to deter conduct, the criminal side of the house really becomes that vehicle. I think we still see this where those that have laws that are in place without criminal penalties are using certain coding on insurance to be able to continue harming kids in a way that they're undetected. And I think when the legislature decided to make these criminal penalties, it really sent a strong message that this is behavior that we're not going to tolerate. I'd say this, we've not fully won our case. We sit in the shoes that many around the country are. The ways in which these laws were challenged became such an effective tool for the left, because when we first passed our law, we were challenged on the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. The plaintiffs did not challenge surgeries, so they left that portion out of the litigation. But what they were able to do with a conservative judge is have a very limited evidentiary record that gave us the complete inability to conduct full-blown discovery, which you've now seen the virtue and the value of that, so that we had a federal judge like ours in Alabama and across the country that were simply hearing very short versions of stories from parents about what they needed to be able to do to keep their kids from committing suicide, to doctors being able to latch on to WPATH and other medical organizations saying this is the standard of care, be able to trot out this term of medically necessary as a way of convincing judges that this was an issue of parental rights as opposed to a question of protecting kids. And it's why you saw for so long that states were losing in an effort to be able to do right by our children. And it wasn't until, the Sixth Circuit, really through Judge Sutton, laid out not only the ways in which conservative judges ought to view the issue, but by that time we had begun to develop much more of a robust record compared to other states. And really that was the first time through our briefing that we began to expose what, in the grand scheme of things, we were able to do in the Briefings Committee, which was that medical, legal, and ethical fraud of epic proportions. And that's where we were able to change the tide of these cases.
But that changing of the tide took time. And Allen recounted that, as the citizens of the state and other advocates started raising the alarm, they were able to carry the bill across the finish line.
It was a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of adversity, a lot of opposition, but there were so many good people that came together to lock arms to get this across the finish line, to become the second state to get it done, to be the tip of the spear in this fight. And of course, you've seen around the country that there have been other states, many other states that have passed this piece of legislation. But to go back and to think back on all those, like Miss Erin Brewer and Patrick Lappert and Becky Garrix and just so many like-minded conservative Christian groups that came together to say, no, we're not doing this in the state of Alabama, not to our children. We're going to protect our kids. And we came together and did it. And to see the opposition, to see what they were willing to say, the left is not tolerant, right? They are not tolerant. And we saw that from the left who opposed us in this particular bill over the 3 years. But I got to give credit to all those people that came and testified in support of the bill, all the doctors, everyone that helped with this piece of legislation. They didn't back up 1 inch. And a lot of that was covered in prayer by a lot of different people.
And one of those doctors who has refused to back down was Patrick Lappert, a plastic surgeon from Decatur in northern Alabama. For over a decade, he's been among the small cadre of physicians who've been speaking out on panels of dissenting medical professionals, appearing in documentary films, and exposing the harms of these procedures. In his home state, he provided expert testimony during the legislative hearings for the bill. I asked him how he first became involved.
Well, I began giving presentations on the topic, mostly to church groups back in 2014. But as a result of doing that and that coming to light, I don't know how these things make their way around our culture, but I got a phone call from Abigail Schreier, who told me she was in the process of preparing a book while she was a writer for the Wall Street Journal. She was approached by friends who said, "What's happening to our daughters? What's going on with our daughters?" And Abigail started looking into it. And we had a long conversation on the phone where we reviewed things that she was uncovering. And she came to me for information about these procedures like mastectomies and things. That's when the details, the numbers, this incredible 5,000% spike in a matter of a couple of years, and a completely new demographic. What had been a problem for little boys had suddenly become a problem for adolescent young adult women. And why was that happening? And why was nobody interested in this? The American Society of Plastic Surgery's response was what I would expect from a group of plastic surgeons because of the nature of plastic surgery. Our default position as plastic surgeons is not to tell other surgeons how to work. One of the attractions for me in going into plastic surgery was that I could live an independent professional life. So our default position is, whatever. It's obviously he's a board certified plastic surgeon and he claims successes here. Fine. I'm not interested, but go ahead. So that sort of laissez-faire attitude is classic for plastic surgery. At the same time, the enterprise model is also classic for plastic surgery. And I could see it, for example, I went to the California Society of Plastic Surgery meeting some years back with the intention specifically of sampling the world of gender affirmation surgery. And here's an interesting sort of little demonic moment. All of Sunday morning was devoted to that topic. I had to go to church the night before because I was going to be going to this. Yeah. And so I might have made it like a 5:30 mass in San Francisco. Anyway, it was essentially 4 solid hours of plastic surgeons teaching one another about how to bring this into your practice. The technology you'll be looking for, the patient care models you'll be looking for, how to work the insurance companies, how to bully the insurance companies using the threat of litigation. All of these things were being talked about there, and it was the enterprise model. So the society didn't say anything about that either. But meanwhile, plastic surgeons are making buku bucks doing gender affirmation surgery. Well, finally, someone like you asked them, well, you guys support this stuff? And what did they do? They did what I'd expect them to do. They said, yeah, we really haven't affirmed that this is a good idea. The American Society of Plastic Surgery hasn't taken a stand. That's what they said. They didn't say, oh, we're against this. They said, we haven't taken a stand on it, but good for them. They're forming a study group. And I know that's afoot right now. And I have confidence because, again, I know plastic surgeons generally, that it's going to demonstrate the truth. Why do I know this? Because the past president of the American Society of Plastic Surgery, Rod Rohrich, was one of the great champions of evidence-based medicine being applied to the practice of plastic surgery. And he developed a very airtight way of assessing the value of scientific evidence in plastic surgery. So all the stuff is there. The tools are there. The case reports are there. I'm waiting because up to now, I have been sorely embarrassed by a society that I was a member of for 20 years.
The American medical associations appear to be the last holdouts in the world as European nations continue to back away from this treatment protocol. Still, all signs point to the walls crumbling down. Ironically, the Boe versus Marshall case wound up being one of the most strategic blunders that transgender activists and their allies in the government could have made. In December, it was Tennessee's law banning gender medical interventions for minors that was adjudicated in U.S. versus Skrmetti. Opposing Tennessee was both the American Civil Liberties Union and the Biden Department of Justice. Marshall believes that the Department of Justice at the time made the strategic choice to go after Tennessee and not Alabama, thinking that it was their best shot for a win. But boy, were they wrong. On June 18th, in a 6-3 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Tennessee's favor, delivering a blow to the trans movement.
Tennessee's record was not nearly as robust. It was, I think, the strategic challenge at that time the DOJ made to say this is our best opportunity to be successful, because when you limit courts' understanding of the background of what was going on, it made their opportunity to argue much stronger. And it's why, uniquely, I sort of jokingly tell people all the time that I'm professionally jealous that my colleague, Jonathan Skrmetti, will have his name associated with it at the Supreme Court. But if they'd taken the Alabama brief up, our case up, we would not have had the ability to write the brief that we did in that case. And it's why I think it was a strategic blunder from the beginning of the Garland administration to sue Alabama, because we fought back and did it in, I think, a very effective way. But had the plaintiffs chosen Alabama's case to take up, which they could have done, right, and been making the same arguments, then we would not have had the opportunity to do what we did.
But Marshall did take the opportunity to detail what happened in the Alabama lawsuit friend of the court brief for the Skrmetti case. As a result of the discovery process, where Marshall not only deposed the man who authored the latest version of the WPATH guidelines, he also exposed the federal government actors who were instrumental in shaping them, including internal communications showing Admiral Rachel Levine's urging against any age restrictions for transgender medical procedures. Levine's scandalous words to WPATH publicly emerged in late June, and on the morning of June 27th, the Biden administration made the first statement in memory against transgender ideology, saying that they did not support gender surgeries for minors. Some wondered if the statement was because Biden was trying to get ahead of the issue should President Trump bring up the issue that night at a debate, the now infamous face-off during which Biden fell apart and ultimately exited the presidential race. Trump did not bring up the issue that night, and the Biden administration days later reversed course, backpedaling on their statement. Many believe this was clearly at the behest of pressure from LGBT advocates. But regardless of what precipitated it, trans activists were finally on the defensive. And yet there was more. The 8th version of the WPATH Standards of Care includes eunuchs as a type of gender-diverse person. Where did they find guidance to support eunuch gender people? The answer, Marshall's team would find out, was in a seedy internet forum called the Eunuch Archive. Inside those disturbing chat rooms, fetishistic academics and others swapped written pornography with castration and sexual abuse of children as its dominant themes. The members of the Eunuch Archive and the details of the horrifying content in the online forum were first reported by the independent feminist publication Redux in May of 2022. When Marshall saw the Redux reporting, he not only cited it in his amicus brief to the Supreme Court last year, he felt completely vindicated in going after WPATH in the manner he did.
It was the ultimate affirmation that we were right. And I never forget, 2 of the lawyers working on the case walking in my office after they found that email to begin with, saying that while we've been amazed at what we've seen already, you'll never believe this. I mean, we're using fantasy chat rooms to define standards of care for kids. And it's why it became such an effective tool for us in the questioning of WPATH members and those that were on the team developing the standards of care, when I truly do believe this is 70-30, 80-20 issue. You put that out in front of folks that don't normally pay attention to this, and you don't have to have a medical degree to understand this is lunacy. And especially when it involves vulnerable kids that just are struggling with where they are in life. And we acknowledge the struggle. I mean, we accept the fact that there's all kind of discussions we could have around what are the drivers of those. And that's another podcast altogether, right? But this is one of those moments which made the reason why we were aggressive in the decision to push back all the more right when we made it.
So, A.G. Marshall, how did it hit you when the dark reality of this sank in, that you were dealing with monstrous, porn-sick perverts in chat rooms devising health guidelines for eunuchs? I mean, that's just unbelievably grim. What was that like, and how did you keep going in light of the gravity of what was uncovered?
So I come from a prosecutor background, and what it reminded me of are those moments where I, as a prosecutor, had to look at child pornography for purposes of the prosecution. And as disturbing as it is, it was also a reminder of how important that work was to provide accountability. The criminal justice system obviously is designed in that way, but it gave us the opportunity, by learning of this information, as hard as it is to understand and even wrap your head around, because it's not normal. It doesn't make common sense. There's no rational basis of why this can be connected to science. But it was like exhibit A to why this is so insane. And so it's got a great group of folks here that are just committed to the mission, that would go to the ends of the earth to answer the questions. And this was just one of those paths they had to follow. And again, reminding me of the efforts that we see law enforcement do through computer forensics and what prosecutors do to hold offenders accountable. Because you see the worst of society, the depravity that's there, but let's use the work that we did to be exposed to it to make a difference in the work that we're doing.
Dr. Lappert, how does this even happen? How is it that doctors and hospitals, even in a state like Alabama, go so crazy and allow and approve something so awful to be enshrined and carried out against so many children and young people?
This is kind of the nature of the medical industrial process now. It has its roots in academia, and University of Alabama, Birmingham is a force to be reckoned with. They're a very large medical teaching institution that reaches into both public and private practice of medical care throughout the state. And you're talking about a very large enterprise that has influences within the legislature. So I consider it a matter of, in certain particular cases, great courage that they were willing to bring this stuff forth. By the same token, those were the same forces that worked to resist us. So within any community, I don't care how red your state is or how traditional your state may be, if you have a university there, you have gender ideology there. And if you have gender ideology there, then it's flowing out into your community through teaching credentialing, through nursing credentialing, even the practice of law. It's reaching into everywhere. So Alabama is certainly no exception. And as the world knows, Alabama is very much a presence in the collegiate world. Roll Tide.
But there's another lingering question, one that many are pondering. How does this moral filth fester in medical associations, which are supposed to be some of our most trusted organizations?
I kind of suspect that, knowing the way professional medical societies work, and I've been following it since 2014. That's when I first jumped into this whole topic. And so one of the first documents you got to read through, because everybody cites WPATH, everybody you talk to, I was looking for the scientific evidence in support of this treatment, approaching it as a physician surgeon, just trying to flesh out the details there so we could understand the gravity of the problem. And when you start reading the WPATH standards of care, I started reading in version 7, it becomes evident when you actually look at the papers that they cite in support of these interventions that there's no science there. And it doesn't take a Nobel Prize winner to suss that out. And so it's smacked of a conspiracy from the very beginning, a conspiracy that's one of the things that most strongly motivates you, apart from the horrors of what they're actually doing, is the fact that you have to conspire together to get something like this done. And that's what the discovery from the Alabama case has shown us, the level of depravity, of craven lust for money, for influence, particularly in academia, influence in academia, the money that flows into the universities from these politically driven interest groups that have usurped control of the medical industrial apparatus, if you will. And we've seen it in other medical emergencies in the last few years. This is perhaps the crowning jewel of evil in the world of medical industrial assault on humanity.
On January 28th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order calling for an end to gender transitions for children and the revoking of WPATH's guidelines. It also called the practice of transing kids a stain on our nation's history. The executive order further empowered federal agencies to take appropriate action within their scope of authority to address the issue head on. And in May, the Health and Human Services Department issued an approximately 400-page report that declared that the evidentiary basis for these so-called treatments is simply not there. Although there is much more that will no doubt unfold across the federal government in the coming months, there's no doubt that Alabama's substantive efforts in the years leading up to this moment paved the way. I asked Secretary Allen how he thinks his work and all those in his state should be remembered.
I'm sure I won't be here when all the history books are written about what we did. I just hope that in the end, we recognized an issue. We were not afraid to get in the fight, not afraid to expose what was going on with this child mutilation gender ideology that was sweeping the country, and to plant our flag, like I said, to bring attention to it and to pass common sense. I keep going back to that, but it was just common sense to protect children. And I'm proud that we did it. I want my children to be able to look back and say, Dad fought the fights that were worth fighting.
Next time on Generation Indoctrination, we'll hear from those who are picking up the pieces in light of these emerging legal and cultural victories. Although the tide is indisputably turning, the fallout is vast. What about those who've endured some of the worst? Stay tuned.